Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Crusaders, the Epic History of the Wars for the Holy Lands by New York Times bestselling author Dan Jones. This is from chapter 1. It begins the book, The Count and the Imam. Count Roger of Sicily lifted his leg and farted. "By the truth of my religion," he exclaimed, "there is more use in that than in what you are here to say." His advisors stood chastened and a little perplexed. The Count before them was in his late 40s and salted to his bones with the experience of military campaigning in southern Italy and the islands of the central Mediterranean. As a young warrior, he had been described by one flatterer as tall and well-made, a most fluent speaker, shrewd in counsel, far-sighted in the planning of things to be done, cheerful and pleasant to everyone. In middle age, he had hardened somewhat and was not one to waste his words on fools. The plan the advisors had recommended had seemed like a good one, as courtiers' plans very often do, before they are shredded by the critiques of short-tempered potentates. Not far across the sea from Sicily, roughly 75 miles at the closest point, lay the remains of what had in ancient times been called Carthage, afterward the Roman province of Africa, and now in the 11th century, Ifriqiya. Its cities, including the capital Mahdia and on the coast, and Cairun Island, where a vast mosque and school had for many generations been frequented by the greatest philosophers and natural scientists in North Africa, were under the shaky command of a crumbling dynasty of Berber Muslims known as the Zirids. The countryside was controlled by various Arab Bedouin tribes sent from Egypt to drive the Zirids out. Political stability was collapsing. Here lay warm and fertile farmlands. There sat prosperous port towns, all ripe for the taking. Roger's counselors thought so, and they had therefore recommended to their testy overlord the proposal of a cousin whom one source names only as Baldwin. This Baldwin had come into possession of a great army of Christian soldiers and was casting around for somewhere godless to conquer. He had asked Roger's blessing to come to Sicily and use it as a launch pad for an invasion of Irafiqua. "I shall be a neighbor of yours," he had explained, as though this were good news. But Roger of Sicily was not feeling neighborly. Irafiqua was undoubtedly ruled by various followers of Islam, he said, but those infidels happened to be sworn partners of the Sicilians in agreements that kept the peace and allowed for a rich exchange of goods in the island's markets and ports. The last thing he wanted, he ranted to his gathered minions, was a cousin imposing on his hospitality, waging a reckless war that would disrupt Sicilian trade if it was successful, and cost him a lot of money in military support if it failed. Irafiqua may indeed have been vulnerable, but if anyone was going to exploit that, it was going to be Roger himself. He had spent the last 2.5 decades, almost his entire adult life, carving out his rule in the region, and it would have been a limp end indeed if he were now to put it at risk, in pursuit of some harebrained scheme cooked up by a kinsman who had never troubled the soil of the island with his sweat. If this Baldwin wanted to fight Muslims, said Roger, he would have to find a different part of the Mediterranean in which to go about his business. There were plenty of places he could name that would be preferable to Sicily's backyard. He summoned Baldwin's personal envoy to his presence and informed him of his decisions. If his master was really serious, he said, then the best way to proceed is to conquer Jerusalem. That is how it all began. Roger, Count of Sicily, was 11th century Europe's ultimate self-made man. He was born around the year 1040 as the youngest of 12 sons sired by a minor nobleman from Normandy called Tancred of Hauteville. Given the protocols of inheritance, being born even as a second son implied a lifelong burden of fortune hunting rather than easy inheritance. To have 11 brothers ahead of you was a disaster. But by the end of the century, the Normans had begun to conquer their way around Western Europe. They took command of Saxon England in 1066. At the same time, southern Italy fell under their gaze, and opportunities that may have seemed limited for younger sons within Normandy itself, but for anyone prepared to travel, opportunity abounded. As a young man, therefore, Roger had left his homeland in what is now northwest France and set out for territory that already called many of his kinsmen and countrymen, the rich but unstable southern Italian regions of Calabria and Apulia. Toe and heel of the Italian boot, Calabria and Apulia were lands where resources were plentiful, authority was contested, and an ambitious young man with a yen for politics and warfare might make his name. Other Normans of the Hauteville clan had already found success here, fighting against the rival superpowers in the region, principally the Byzantine Greeks and Roman popes, both of whom regarded the Normans with suspicion bordering on alarm. The book Crusaders, The Epic History of the Wars for the Holy Lands by Dan Jones.